The summer heat of Mobile, Alabama in 1856 felt like a living thing, thick enough to choke on. But for Ruth, a young enslaved woman in her late teens, the suffocating air was nothing compared to the weight of the chains she'd worn since her first breath. She'd seen horrors that would break most people: children ripped from mothers, flesh torn by whips, humans sold like livestock. But Ruth had something different inside her, something dangerous. A fire that refused to die, no matter how many times they tried to beat it out of her. And there was one man who'd made it his personal mission to extinguish that flame forever. The Overseer, that's what everyone called him, though he had a name Ruth refused to speak, was a monster who wore the face of a man. While some overseers did their job with reluctance, this one embraced cruelty like a lover. His whip wasn't a tool of last resort. It was an extension of his arm, eager to taste flesh at the slightest excuse. Ruth's back was a roadmap of his sadism, each scar a chapter in a story of systematic torture. But the physical pain was only the beginning. The Overseer had developed a particular interest in Ruth that went beyond casual cruelty. He would watch her in the fields, his eyes tracking her movements with an intensity that made her skin crawl. He'd find reasons to separate her from the others, to exercise his power in ways both subtle and overt. The other enslaved workers whispered about her when they thought no one could hear. They saw something in Ruth, a spark of defiance in the set of her jaw, in the way she held her shoulders just a fraction too straight, in the brief flash of fire in her eyes before she remembered to look away. The Overseer saw that spark too, and it enraged him. He made breaking Ruth his personal mission, assigning her the hardest tasks, the most backbreaking labor. When she stumbled, he struck. When she moved too slowly, he struck. When she looked at him with eyes that still held a hint of humanity, he struck hardest of all. The punishments grew more frequent, more severe, designed to reduce her to hopeless submission. But Ruth endured, and as she endured, something changed. The fear began to transform into something more dangerous, a cold, hard rage that burned with increasing intensity. She thought about freedom. She thought about escape. And in her darkest moments, she thought about revenge. These were dangerous thoughts, thoughts that could get a person killed just for thinking them. But they kept her alive when everything else counseled surrender. Then came the news that would change everything. The Overseer was getting married. He'd courted a young woman from a neighboring plantation, a Southern belle pretty and accomplished in all the ways that mattered to their society. The wedding would be a grand affair, bringing together Mobile's elite for an evening of music, dancing, and conspicuous consumption. For Ruth and the other enslaved workers, it meant additional backbreaking work, preparing the house, cooking massive quantities of food, training for the specific protocols of a formal event. But for Ruth, the news carried a different weight entirely. This man who had tormented her for years was about to embark on a new chapter filled with happiness and social advancement. He would marry his bride, establish himself more firmly in the planter class, and continue his reign of terror with the added respectability of marriage and family. The injustice burned in Ruth's chest like acid. While she had her humanity denied and her body brutalized, this monster would enjoy every privilege society had to offer. As the wedding date approached, Ruth was assigned to help with preparations, forcing her into close proximity with the Overseer more than usual. During one encounter, he cornered her in the hallway, standing too close, his breath reeking of whiskey and tobacco. He wanted her to understand that even as he prepared to marry, even as he took on the trappings of respectability, his power over her remained absolute. He could do whatever he wanted, whenever he wanted, and there was no justice to which she could turn. Ruth kept her eyes downcast, giving him no reaction. But inside, something shifted irreversibly. A decision was made, though she barely acknowledged it to herself. The rage that had been building for years, reached a new intensity. The overseer dismissed her with casual cruelty, and she returned to her tasks. But she was no longer the same person. The wedding was scheduled for a Saturday evening in late summer. The plantation house transformed into a scene of celebration, decorated with flowers and lit by hundreds of candles. Musicians were hired, the best Mobile had to offer. The guest list included the cream of local society, men and women whose wealth was built entirely on the labor of people they considered property. Ruth was awakened before dawn on the wedding day, her body already aching, and immediately put to work. The bride arrived in the afternoon, beautiful in the way youth and privilege create beauty, skin unblemished, hands soft and unmarked, dressed in silk and lace that cost more than most enslaved people would see in a lifetime. As evening fell, guests arrived in elaborate carriages. They came dressed in their finest, greeted with champagne and delicacies prepared by enslaved cooks who'd worked through the night. Ruth moved through the scene like a ghost, performing her tasks with mechanical precision, while her mind worked through thoughts she barely dared acknowledge. The ceremony was brief but elaborate. The overseer and his bride exchanged vows, promising to love and honor each other until death parted them. Ruth stood in the corner with other enslaved servants, required to be present but invisible, witnessing a ritual that celebrated bonds between two people while existing in a society that routinely destroyed bonds between enslaved families without a second thought. When the ceremony concluded, the celebration began in earnest. The newlyweds took to the floor for their first dance, moving together with practiced grace. The champagne flowed freely, and the mood grew increasingly jovial. But something was building inside Ruth with each passing moment. Every smile on the overseer's face, every tender gesture toward his bride, every congratulation he received, all of it fed the rage that had been growing for years. This man who had inflicted endless pain was being rewarded, celebrated, welcomed into an even more secure position in the society that enabled his cruelty. The evening wore on. Some guests drank too much, others paired off for whispered conversations. The enslaved servants continued their work, maintaining the facade of effortless hospitality. During one trip to the kitchen, Ruth encountered Sarah, an older enslaved woman who had worked in the house for decades. Sarah looked at Ruth with eyes that had witnessed too much suffering. "Child," she said quietly, "whatever you're thinking about doing, don't. They'll kill you, and probably others besides. The system's too big, too powerful." Ruth said nothing. She simply took her tray and returned to the ballroom, leaving Sarah with a sense of foreboding she couldn't name. As midnight approached, guests began taking their leave. The house gradually emptied until only the immediate wedding party remained. The bride, exhausted, excused herself to prepare for bed. The overseer lingered downstairs with remaining friends, smoking cigars and continuing political discussions. Then came the order that sealed everything in place. Ruth was ordered to help the bride prepare for her wedding night. She found herself in the bride's chambers, helping remove the elaborate wedding gown while the young woman chatted idly about the wedding and her hopes for her new life. The bride seemed genuinely happy, blissfully unaware that one of the women helping her undress had been regularly brutalized by the man she'd just married. Once the bride was settled, Ruth was dismissed to help with final cleanup. The overseer had gone upstairs to join his bride. The great house grew quiet, with only the sounds of servants finishing their work. Ruth moved through the cleanup automatically, her body going through motions while her mind traveled elsewhere. She thought about the whip scars on her back. She thought about others who had suffered and died under the overseer's control. She thought about the fundamental injustice of a world where such a man could be celebrated while his victims were denied basic human dignity. Something crystallized in Ruth's mind during those final hours. She simply knew she could not let this night end as it was supposed to, with the overseer rewarded and comfortable while she returned to her quarters to prepare for another day of suffering. The other servants gradually finished and drifted away to their quarters. Ruth lingered, finding small tasks, waiting until she was effectively alone in the main house. She knew the layout intimately. She knew which floorboards creaked and which stairs could be climbed silently. And she knew where the overseer kept his whip when in the house, hanging on a peg in his small office, always within reach, a constant reminder of his power. Ruth stood in the darkened hallway, her heart pounding. Every instinct screamed at her to return to the quarters, to survive as she'd always survived, by enduring, by bending but not breaking. But something had shifted irreversibly. The part of her that had learned survival through submission was being drowned out by a louder voice, one that spoke of dignity and justice. Ruth moved through the house like a sleepwalker toward the overseer's office. The door opened silently. Moonlight filtered through the window, illuminating the whip hanging on its peg. Ruth approached slowly, her hand trembling as she reached out. The leather was worn smooth from years of use, stained with sweat and perhaps traces of blood. The handle felt solid in her grip, heavier than expected, weighted with more than just physical mass. For a long moment, Ruth simply stood there holding the whip. If she went upstairs now, there would be no going back. They would kill her, certainly. Probably torture her first to make an example. They might punish other enslaved people as well. Sarah's warning echoed in her mind, the futility, the danger, the inevitability of a terrible end. But Ruth had moved beyond calculation of consequences. Something inside her had already died, killed by years of systematic brutalization. What remained was willing to trade whatever time she had left for one moment of striking back at her oppressor. It wasn't rational, it wasn't strategic, but it was human in the most fundamental way, the refusal to accept endless degradation without response. Ruth left the office, whip coiled in her hand, and began climbing the stairs. Each step was deliberate, careful to avoid boards she knew would creak. The house remained silent around her. No one suspected anything unusual was happening. No one imagined that one of the people they'd rendered invisible was about to make herself terrifyingly visible. The door to the master suite stood before her, heavy oak with brass fittings. Ruth placed her hand on the handle and pushed gently. Well-oiled hinges made no sound. Inside, the room was dark, except for one candle burning low. She could make out the large bed, and in it, two figures deep in sleep after their exhausting day. Ruth stepped inside, closing the door with exquisite care. She stood, letting her eyes adjust, observing the scene. The overseer lay on his back, snoring slightly. His bride slept curled on her side, dark hair spread across the pillow, face peaceful and untroubled. They looked vulnerable in sleep, stripped of social armor, just two humans in temporary oblivion. For a brief instant, doubt flickered through Ruth's mind. The bride had done nothing directly to her. But then Ruth thought about all the enslaved women whose wedding nights were interrupted by being sold away from their husbands. All the mothers whose children were torn from their arms. All the people who had no control over the most intimate aspects of their lives. Ruth uncoiled the whip, feeling its weight, the same weight the overseer had felt countless times before using it against her. The first crack shattered the silence like a thunderclap. The leather struck the overseer across his legs. He jolted awake with a yell of pain and confusion. Before he could process what was happening, the whip fell again and again. Ruth struck with all the strength and rage accumulated over years of suffering, finding its target with accuracy born of bitter familiarity. The overseer scrambled to escape, tangled in bed linens, his shouts mixing with curses and demands to know what was happening. The bride woke screaming, her peaceful sleep shattered by violence she'd never experienced. She tried to flee, but became entangled in her nightgown and bedding. Ruth's whip found her too, not with the same concentrated fury directed at the overseer, but enough to mark her, enough to ensure she'd carry physical reminders of this night. Ruth felt nothing except pure release of years of suppressed rage. Her arm rose and fell with mechanical precision, the whip an extension of her will, each strike a word in a statement she'd never been allowed to make. The overseer managed to get off the bed and tried to advance toward her, but she drove him back with strikes to his face and chest. He stumbled backward, crashing into furniture, his earlier drunkenness and disorientation making his movements clumsy. Running feet echoed in the hallway, other household members drawn by screams. Ruth knew her time was measured in seconds. She could hear voices shouting, people demanding to know what was happening. But she didn't stop. She continued to strike until the door burst open and several men rushed in, tackling her to the ground. The whip was torn from her grasp, hands pinned her arms with brutal force. In the confusion that followed, candles were lit, illuminating a scene burned into everyone's memory. The overseer stood against the far wall, nightshirt torn and bloody, face marked by red welts that would soon turn to bruises. His bride huddled on the floor, sobbing hysterically, nightgown disheveled and marked with evidence of whipping. And Ruth, held down by multiple men, stared up with eyes showing no fear, no regret, only fierce satisfaction at having finally struck back. The overseer, gathering himself enough to speak, began screaming orders. He wanted Ruth killed immediately, right there in the room. His voice cracked with rage and something else, perhaps shock at experiencing the kind of helpless terror he'd inflicted on others for years. But the plantation owner, woken by commotion, took control. Ruth was dragged from the room, down the stairs, and thrown into a storage cellar that could serve as temporary prison. In the darkness of that cellar, body beginning to register injuries from being tackled, Ruth sat against the cold stone wall and allowed herself to feel something like peace for the first time in years. She knew what was coming. They would make an example of her, ensure her death was public and terrible. But in that moment, she felt free in a way she'd never experienced while alive. She had refused to accept degradation passively. She had struck back at her oppressor, made him feel even a fraction of the fear and pain he'd inflicted on others. Upstairs, the house remained in chaos for hours. The bride was inconsolable, her fantasy of married bliss shattered on her wedding night. The overseer paced furiously, planning elaborate revenge. The other enslaved people, gradually learning what happened, experienced a complex mixture of emotions: fear of inevitable retribution, concern for Ruth, and beneath it all, carefully hidden satisfaction that someone had finally done what many had dreamed of doing. News spread rapidly through Mobile's slave community, carried by the invisible network that existed among the enslaved. Within days, every enslaved person in the region knew about Ruth, about what she'd done, about how she'd whipped the overseer and his bride on their wedding night. The story was told and retold, each telling adding to its power as a narrative of resistance. For people who had so few stories of successful defiance, Ruth's action became legendary almost immediately. The white community reacted with predictable outrage and fear. The incident was seen as an intolerable breach of social order, a challenge to the entire system keeping slavery functional. Ruth had to be punished severely, not just for what she'd done, but to send a message to every other enslaved person who might harbor similar thoughts. The days following Ruth's defiance were marked by tension hanging over the plantation like a physical presence. The enslaved community moved through tasks with heightened anxiety, knowing collective punishment was possible. Overseers patrolled with even greater vigilance, watching for any sign of sympathy for Ruth's actions. The whip fell more frequently, as if increased brutality could somehow restore absolute control that Ruth had shattered. Ruth remained in the cellar, locked in darkness, broken only by thin strips of light filtering through door gaps. They brought no food for 2 days, only water enough to keep her alive for whatever punishment they were planning. On the 3rd day, the door opened. Several men entered carrying torches. Ruth squinted against sudden brightness, eyes adjusted to near-total darkness. They hauled her to her feet roughly, binding her hands behind her back with rope that cut into her wrists. As they dragged her upstairs and out of the house, she caught glimpses of other enslaved people watching from a distance, faces carefully blank, but eyes betraying fear and fascination. Sarah, the old woman who'd warned her, stood near the kitchen door, weathered face showing a mixture of sorrow and something that might have been respect. They took Ruth to a cleared area near the main barn, visible from much of the plantation. A crowd was already gathering, white overseers and managers, enslaved people ordered to attend, even neighboring planters who'd come to witness the spectacle. The plantation owner stood at the center, face grave with weight of the decision he was about to execute. The injured overseer was there too, still bearing marks of Ruth's whipping, expression a mask of barely controlled rage and satisfaction. Ruth was forced to her knees in the clearing's center. A man she didn't recognize, brought in specifically for this task, stood nearby holding a whip far more brutal than the one she'd used, a cat o' nine tails designed to inflict maximum damage. The plantation owner began to speak, voice carrying across the assembled crowd. He talked about the necessity of order, about the natural hierarchy governing their society, about consequences of disrupting that order. He spoke of Ruth's crime as an assault not just on one man, but on the entire system of civilization they'd built. What followed was a demonstration of the systematic cruelty forming slavery's foundation. The whipping was conducted methodically, designed to last long enough to serve as deterrent while stopping short of killing Ruth immediately. They wanted her to survive long enough to suffer more. Each strike of the cat o' nine tails tore flesh. Ruth's blood soon stained the ground beneath her. She'd been ordered not to scream, told any sound would result in additional lashes. But this was torment, designed to break that silence. For the first dozen lashes, Ruth maintained silence through sheer force of will, biting her own lip until it bled. But eventually sounds escaped her, low, guttural noises torn from deep within. The man wielding the whip showed no emotion, arm rising and falling with practiced efficiency. The enslaved people forced to watch struggled with their reactions. Some kept faces completely blank, others wept quietly. A few younger ones had to look away, despite orders. When the whipping finally ended, Ruth collapsed forward onto blood-soaked ground, barely conscious. But her ordeal wasn't over. The plantation owner announced she would be sold away to the deep south, sent where conditions were notoriously worse, to work in swamps and cane fields until her body gave out. This was meant as a fate worse than death, prolonged torture rather than quick execution. It also served to remove her from the plantation where she might become a martyr. They threw Ruth into a wagon with other enslaved people being sold for various reasons. She lay in the wagon bed, each movement sending new waves of agony through her shredded back. The others looked at her with a mixture of fear and awe. They knew what she'd done. The story had spread that quickly. The journey to the slave market took several days. Ruth drifted in and out of consciousness, wounds becoming infected in heat and humidity, fever burning through her body. The traders showed minimal care necessary to keep their cargo alive long enough to sell. During brief, lucid moments, Ruth wondered about what she'd done. She felt no regret for striking back, but she wondered about the cost to others. Had her action resulted in harsher treatment for those left behind? But Ruth didn't know something crucial. Her story was already spreading far beyond the plantation where it occurred. Enslaved people across the South or hearing about the woman who'd whipped her overseer on his wedding night. The story was being told in quarters after dark, whispered during brief moments when enslaved people could gather without white supervision. Each telling added details until Ruth became almost mythical, a symbol of resistance, proof that fighting back was possible, even if the cost was terrible. The slave market was a nightmare beyond imagination. Human beings displayed like livestock, examined physically in degrading ways, bodies assessed for capacity to labor. Ruth's scarred back and weakened condition made her less valuable, but there was still market for damaged slaves in operations where life expectancy was measured in months. She was purchased by a buyer representing a sugar plantation in Louisiana, one of the most brutal forms of agricultural slavery that existed. The sugar harvest was so demanding, it killed workers at an appalling rate, creating constant demand for new laborers to replace those who died or become too broken to work. Ruth was shackled with other newly purchased slaves and loaded onto a riverboat. During the journey, she was chained next to an older man who'd been enslaved his entire life, sold when his previous owner died. He spoke to her quietly at night when guards were less attentive. He knew who she was. Her story had reached even him in the short time since it occurred. He told her that what she'd done mattered, that it gave others hope, even if the cost was unbearable. He said resistance took many forms, and hers had been spectacular enough to be remembered. Throughout the South, enslaved people were talking about her. Some would be inspired to their own acts of resistance. Others would draw strength simply from knowing someone had fought back. Ruth wasn't sure she believed him. She felt like a cautionary tale rather than inspiration. But the old man insisted she didn't understand the full impact. The story of Ruth would become part of the oral tradition of resistance, passed down through generations as proof that their oppressors were not invincible. The sugar plantation was as brutal as its reputation. Work was backbreaking and dangerous. Hours were endless during harvest. Overseers were as cruel as any she'd encountered. The scarring on her back marked her as a troublemaker, meaning she received even harsher treatment. But Ruth had already made her peace with death. She'd struck her blow, refused to accept endless degradation passively. Whatever came after was simply the price of that refusal. What Ruth couldn't have known was that her story was reaching beyond the enslaved community. White abolitionists in the North heard about the incident through underground networks. They seized on her story as evidence of slavery's fundamental injustice, proof that enslaved people were not passive victims, but human beings capable of resistance and dignity. The South's white population had a very different reaction. Ruth's story confirmed their worst fears about what would happen if slavery wasn't maintained through constant vigilance and brutal punishment. The two sides of the growing national debate used Ruth's story to support opposing positions, neither fully understanding or caring about Ruth herself as a human being rather than symbol. On the sugar plantation, Ruth survived longer than many expected. Perhaps the same force of will that had driven her to resist helped her endure conditions that broke others more quickly. She became known among enslaved workers as someone who'd fought back, and this gave her a kind of status even in that hellish place. The years blurred together in unrelenting labor and physical suffering. During harvest season, workers labored from before dawn until after dark, cutting cane stalks with machetes, hauling massive loads, working in suffocating heat where cane was boiled down. Machinery was dangerous, claiming fingers, hands, sometimes entire limbs from workers too exhausted to maintain caution. Ruth's scarred back made certain movements excruciating, but overseers showed no mercy. They drove her as hard as anyone, perhaps harder because they knew her history and wanted to break whatever spirit remained. But something fundamental had changed in Ruth that night when she wielded the whip. The part that feared death had died then. What remained was harder to break than even she'd imagined. In the quarters at night after work ended, Ruth would sometimes tell her story to those who asked. She didn't embellish. The simple facts were powerful enough. Young people would listen with wide eyes. Older people who'd endured decades nodded with understanding. But Ruth always emphasized the cost of her resistance. She made sure people understood her action had brought terrible consequences. She didn't want to inspire reckless rebellion that would get people killed without achieving anything meaningful. Instead, she tried to help others understand that resistance could take many forms, from her spectacular act to quieter defiance that had kept enslaved communities alive for generations. News from the wider world occasionally filtered in. Enslaved people hired out to work in New Orleans would return with information about growing tensions between North and South. There was talk of a presidential election, of a candidate named Lincoln who opposed slavery's expansion. Southern states threatened to secede if he won. The enslaved workers listened with intense interest, knowing their fates hung in balance of political decisions made by people who viewed them as property. Ruth lived to see Lincoln's election in 1860 and the subsequent secession that led to civil war. The war's impact on the plantation was immediate and profound. White men left to fight, leaving the plantation understaffed and increasingly difficult to control. Enslaved workers, sensing the shift in power dynamics, began engaging in more overt resistance, working slowly, feigning illness, disappearing into swamps for days. As Union forces advanced deeper into Confederate territory, word spread about contraband camps where escaped slaves were given refuge and freedom. Ruth, despite weakened physical condition after years of brutal labor, felt a spark of something she hadn't experienced in years: hope. The possibility of freedom, which had seemed impossible during most of her life, suddenly appeared as tangible reality that might be achieved before she died. The plantation's overseers, desperate to maintain control as their world collapsed, became even more brutal. They knew the war was going badly, could see their way of life ending, and reacted with increased violence. Several enslaved people were killed during this period for minor infractions. In spring 1863, Union forces captured New Orleans and began pushing into surrounding areas. The plantation wasn't immediately in the path of Union advance, but it was close enough that everyone could sense approaching change. Some workers began slipping away at night toward Union lines. Those who remained grew bolder. Ruth made her decision during a sweltering night in July 1863. She gathered with a small group who decided to make a run for Union lines. They knew the journey would be dangerous. Confederate patrols looked for escaped slaves, and swamps between plantation and safety were treacherous, even without human enemies. But the chance of freedom outweighed risks. They set out under cover of darkness, following routes mapped by those who'd gone before. The journey took 3 days and was as harrowing as Ruth anticipated. They traveled mostly at night, hiding during the day. They waded through swamps where water moccasins and alligators posed constant threats. They heard patrol sounds in the distance and had to freeze in place, barely breathing, praying they wouldn't be discovered. Ruth's scarred back ached constantly. Her body, weakened by years of brutal labor and inadequate food, threatened to give out multiple times. But she pushed forward, driven by knowledge that this might be her only chance to die free rather than enslaved. On the 4th day, they encountered a Union patrol. The soldiers, initially suspicious, quickly realized they were dealing with escaped slaves heading toward freedom. The patrol escorted them to a contraband camp where hundreds of other formerly enslaved people had gathered. The camp was chaotic and poorly supplied, but it represented something Ruth had never experienced, a place where she was not property, where no one had legal right to beat her or sell her or control her movements. The transition from slavery to freedom wasn't instantaneous or simple. Ruth and others had spent entire lives in bondage, identities, and behaviors shaped by constant need to survive in that system. Freedom brought its own challenges: how to support oneself, how to navigate a world where one had agency but also responsibility, how to process trauma without support structures. Ruth initially worked as a laundress for the Union Army, one of few paid positions available to formerly enslaved women. The work was hard, but it was work she chose, for which she received compensation, however meager. For someone who'd spent her entire life in forced labor, this distinction was profound. She could walk away if she wanted, could negotiate for better conditions, could make decisions about her own time and labor. These were small freedoms, perhaps, but they felt revolutionary. As the war continued, Ruth encountered other formerly enslaved people who knew her story. Her act of resistance in Mobile 9 years earlier had become legendary, passed down through oral tradition. Young people who'd been children when it happened spoke of Ruth as if she were mythological rather than a living woman doing laundry in a contraband camp. She found this attention uncomfortable. She didn't see herself as heroic, merely as someone who'd reached a breaking point. But the old man chained beside her on the riverboat years earlier had been right. Her story had mattered, had given people hope, had proved resistance was possible, even at terrible cost, had become part of the larger narrative of enslaved resistance that would eventually be recognized as crucial to slavery's destruction. Ruth's individual act hadn't by itself changed the system, but it had been part of a larger pattern, from individual defiance to organized rebellions to self-emancipation of hundreds of thousands who fled to Union lines, that made slavery unsustainable. The Emancipation Proclamation, when news finally reached the contraband camp, was met with jubilation, tempered by understanding that legal freedom was only the first step in a much longer journey. Ruth stood among the celebrating crowd, listening to the proclamation being read aloud, and felt complex emotions: relief she'd never again be property, grief for those who died in slavery and would never experience this moment, anger that it had taken a war to achieve what should have been recognized as fundamental human right from the beginning. After the war ended, Ruth settled in New Orleans, joining the community of formerly enslaved people trying to build new lives in the chaotic Reconstruction era. She found work as a seamstress and later as a cook, modest occupations that nonetheless represented a life of her own choosing. She never married. The trauma had left scars deeper than those on her back. But she became an important figure in her community, someone younger people came to for advice and support. Ruth lived long enough to see Reconstruction's promises betrayed, to watch as the brief flowering of Black political power was crushed by restoration of white supremacy through violence and legal mechanisms. She saw implementation of Black codes and later Jim Crow laws that sought to recreate as much of the slavery system as possible without formally re-enslaving people. The disappointment was profound, but Ruth had survived too much to be broken by it. In her final years, Ruth would sit with young people and tell them about the old days, not to glorify suffering, but to ensure the truth of slavery wasn't forgotten or sanitized. She wanted them to understand both the horrors and the ways people had resisted. She told them about the night she'd picked up the whip, not as encouragement for random violence, but as evidence that enslaved people had not been passive victims. Ruth died in 1884 at approximately age 52, the exact year of her birth never having been officially recorded. She was buried in a cemetery for Black residents of New Orleans, her grave marked with a simple stone, giving her name and dates as best they could be estimated. There was no mention on the stone of what she'd done. No indication this was the woman whose act of resistance had become legendary. But her story didn't die with her. It was passed down through generations, kept alive in family histories and community narratives. Eventually, historians interested in the reality of enslaved resistance would uncover references to Ruth in various sources: plantation records, newspaper accounts, oral histories. Ruth's story became part of a larger understanding of slavery, as a system constantly contested by those it sought to control. Modern historians recognize that enslaved people engaged in resistance at every level, from spectacular rebellions to daily acts of defiance. Ruth's act of whipping her overseer on his wedding night was one data point in vast evidence that enslaved people never accepted enslavement passively, never internalized the ideology claiming they were suited for bondage. The wedding night of 1856 lasted only minutes, but its reverberations extended across decades and eventually centuries. Ruth's act reminded everyone who heard about it that enslaved people were human beings with agency, capable of fighting back even when the cost was terrible. It demonstrated that slavery was maintained not through natural order, but through violence, and that violence could potentially be turned back. Ruth's legacy is complex and contested. Some see her act as heroic resistance, others as tragic violence born of an intolerable system. But what cannot be disputed is that she refused to accept endless degradation without response. She claimed her humanity in the most visceral way possible by striking back at the man who tried to reduce her to an object without will or dignity. And in doing so, she became part of the long tradition of resistance that would eventually contribute to slavery's destruction. The system that enslaved Ruth and millions of others would eventually be destroyed, not by any single act, but by accumulated weight of resistance at every level, combined with broader political and military forces. But every act of resistance, from spectacular to mundane, contributed to that destruction. Ruth's whipping of her overseer on his wedding night was one thread in a vast tapestry of defiance, and her story remains a powerful reminder that those who were enslaved never stopped fighting for their freedom and dignity, no matter the cost. If you found Ruth's story as powerful as we did, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Let us know in the comments what you think about Ruth's incredible act of resistance. Your support helps us continue bringing these untold stories to light.